I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. There's this great debate that's been going on for maybe 40 years now about the nature of privacy and surveillance in the telecommunications infrastructure of the future. And really whether we should build facilities for privacy or facilities for surveillance into that infrastructure and how those things should work. It's a political debate, to be sure, but it's also, to some respect, a technical debate in that people bring certain technical assumptions to their policy views on the issue. And it's for us, as technical professionals, to evaluate the validity of those assumptions. Like any good debate, there are two sides. And so, as an example of one side of the debate, I present the IETF policy on wiretapping. It was published in the year 2000 in an RFC. It says that the IETF will not design wiretapping requirements into their protocols. There are a couple different reasons for this. One reason is that the IETF is an international body, and it can't sort of be responsive to the rules of every single country on the planet. Another reason is that the IETF thinks that wiretapping is either easy or it's impossible, because you're either using encryption or you're not. And they refer to RFC 1984, which is sort of ironically numbered, in which they argue that everything ought to be encrypted. And so therefore, wiretapping ought to be impossible. They also say that the internet should be free from security loopholes, and they express the concern that interfaces which could be used for wiretapping might fall into the wrong hands, might be subject to unauthorized use. On the other hand, they say that if you're going to make an internet wiretapping infrastructure, you ought to publish it. And that I think this comment will resonate very well with this community. The IETF believes that the publication of lawful intercept mechanisms and the publication of known weaknesses in those mechanisms is a good thing. We need to have an open dialogue and peer review. And in keeping with this policy, Cisco published an RFC which describes their architecture for lawful intercept in the internet. As far as I know, Cisco is the only company that's ever actually published their architecture in an IETF RFC. So why did Cisco make an architecture for lawful intercept in the internet? So as an example of the other side of the debate, I present the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. It was passed in 1994, and it requires telecommunications companies to provide interfaces that law enforcement can use to access content on their networks. Originally, there was an exception in this law that was built for information services, and people believed that that exempted the internet from the law. The law only applied to voice communications. However, in 2005, the FCC ruled that broadband internet providers are covered by CALEA, and so they have to provide access. The Cisco architecture for lawful intercept predated that ruling, but there are other motivators. There were laws in Europe that were similar to CALEA that applied to the internet before 2005. But also, service providers have law enforcement people coming into their office. They want access to the network. They've got to provide the access somehow, and they want to do it in a way that is not disruptive to their network operations. So having some sort of standard interface for it is something that service providers might deploy even if they're not required to. So let's talk about this Cisco architecture for lawful intercept, because they were nice enough to publish it and were able to peer review it. I first found these RFCs back in 2006, like in the wintertime. And I read them, and I said, my first reaction was, wow, I can't believe I'm actually allowed to read this stuff. I can't believe they published this. You know, it was kind of like, you know, I was seeing the other side or something. And so after I got over my initial excitement about having found it, you know, I said, I have problems with this design. I don't think that this enforces its security requirements the way that I would want them enforced. But at the time, I kind of felt like no one would listen to me about it. So I put it on a shelf. I should have gone and audited SNMP code, and I didn't. But there was a significant implementation flaw in SNMP that affected this infrastructure. And that was found by somebody else. It was disclosed in the summer of 2008. And it allows someone to access an SNMP v3 interface without a password. So given that these, I'll get into the details, but this lawful intercept architecture is based on SNMP v3, that vulnerability has a big impact to people who are running this architecture. I wrote all this stuff up so when I saw that bug, I said, this is it. I've got to put these two things together. And I wrote up a discussion about this architecture and that vulnerability, and I sent it to Cisco maybe in December of 2008. And then I got promoted, and I got really busy at work. And I just did not have time to do any interesting technical things anymore. And so I submitted this thing as a black hat talk because I knew that if I had a hard deadline, I would have to force myself to get everything publication ready and actually come and discuss it. So I want to thank Black Hat for accepting this talk and letting me come here and discuss this because I think it's important. And I think if this talk hadn't been accepted, a lot of this material would never have seen the light of day. So thank you, Black Hat. This is the basic overview of the Cisco architecture for lawful intercept. This LEET ASCII chart comes from the RFC itself. There's a couple of important things to understand about this architecture. The first is that, so this is all based on stuff that was published by the European Technical Standards Institute, ETSI. They sort of define this general overall architecture for lawful intercept, and the Cisco architecture fits in that overall model. So they defined a lot of these interfaces and the like. I don't know if you're supposed to be able to read the ETSI documentation, but it's on cryptome.org or cryptome.org, depending on how you like to pronounce that. The other thing that's, so what's important there is that, first of all, there's a bunch of companies that support this Cisco architecture, not just Cisco. But in addition, there's these whole other groups of other architectures for lawful intercept that are implemented by other companies using other technology that it's not interoperable with the Cisco architecture, but it has the same overall operational architecture. So this is sort of generally how lawful intercept works in all kinds of different contexts. The other thing to say about this is that it's not just a computer architecture. Some of these things in this diagram are computers, and some of them are groups of people. It starts with the law enforcement agency, which is a group of people, and they decide that they want to wiretap a network, and so they get authorization to do that, and they go talk to this lawful intercept administration function. That is a group of people in the ISP who, there's some lawyers there and there's some technical people, and they validate that the law enforcement agency has the authority to access the content they're asking for. And then they use this computer called a mediation device to provision the wiretap according to the authorization that the law enforcement agency has. If you're an ISP, you can outsource this lawful intercept administration function to a consulting company. And they'll bring in their lawyers that vet the lawful authorization that the law enforcement agencies have. And they have technical professionals that understand how to operate all this equipment and get it running on your network. And they'll just take care of it for you. And so this is just a collage of marketing material from different companies that offer that. So back to this architecture. The mediation device is sort of the heart of this lawful intercept system. It's a computer that is used by the administration to provision the TAP, and it sends interception requests out to the devices on the network that actually perform the surveillance. Those devices are called intercept access points, and there's two in this diagram. I'll talk about them a little bit more later. But an intercept access point will get this interception request, it'll perform the surveillance, and take the content that was asked to collect and send it back to the mediation device. Once the mediation device gets the content, it reformats it maybe and sends it on to the law enforcement agency. So there are a bunch of different companies that make mediation devices that interoperate with Cisco routers. So like I said, there's this inner galaxy of different companies that all support this same protocol. Some of the marketing material on these companies' websites is interesting to look at if you're interested in this subject matter. This picture here comes from Verint's website. In addition to the products that Verint makes for lawful intercept, which is what we're talking about today, they also have a different product group called Mass Communications Surveillance Solutions, which has its own set of marketing material, and I found it very interesting, so maybe you would as well. But what's important to understand is that Cisco isn't the only company that supports this architecture. So there's two kinds of IAPs in this network diagram. One's called an IRI IAP, and the other one's called a content IAP. And this relates to the structure of, at least in the United States, how the law works around wiretapping. Traditionally, the kind of communications infrastructure people had was the Postal Service. And in the Postal Service, you have a letter, and it's in an envelope, and there's an address on the outside. And the way that the law traditionally dealt with this is the police, if they wanted to steam open your letter and read the content of it, they would have to get a warrant. But if they wanted to see the addresses that were printed on the outside of your letter, they don't necessarily need a warrant. Because your postman knows who you're sending and receiving mail from, so it's not as private. It's not considered as private as the contents inside the envelope. And because, postal services have been around for a long time, and our legal system was sort of built up around that dichotomy, there's been an attempt both by the court system and the legislatures to maintain that dichotomy in new technologies, even if it doesn't necessarily make as much sense as it used to. So an IRI IAP is designed for situations where they don't have a warrant. Maybe they have an administrative subpoena, and they're looking to just access routing information to addresses, from addresses, SMTP headers, stuff like that, stuff that is equivalent to the outside of the envelope. A content IAP is a device that can collect the contents of the envelope, all of the communications information. Cisco routers are content IAPs. I don't believe that Cisco routers have an IRI IAP interface. So the way that the mediation device provisions the Cisco router to collect content is with this interception request. It's an SNMP v3 request, and it's one single UDP packet, which is a pretty important fact. And it specifies, what information the law enforcement agency would like to collect from the network. You can specify ranges of source and destination addresses, source and destination port numbers. You can include other things like MPLS tags or MAC addresses, whatever specific information relates to what you want to collect. And you also tell the router where to send the stuff once it's collected. You set the destination address and the port, and what transport you want to use to send the content there, and I'll talk more about that too. So that's the basic overview of how this lawful intercept architecture works. Let's stop and consider what the security concerns are associated with building something like this. The first thing that we need to think about is preventing the subject from discovering the surveillance. And if you read Cisco's RFC, they talk about how they don't want to have a device that shows up in a trace route so that you know that you're getting surveilled, right? They think about that. Another thing you want to do is prevent the subject from manipulating the surveillance, either by evading it, transmitting content that wasn't collected that was supposed to be, or by confusing it, by inducing the collection of information that was not transmitted. And so Matt Blaze has been doing some interesting research in this area based on some work that Thomas Potacek contributed to in the late 90s. And Matt Blaze calls this the eavesdropper's dilemma. What do you do with a packet that has a bad checksum? Either you collect it and you give it to a law enforcement agency, and then so the attacker can inject all kinds of bad checksum packets that confuse the law enforcement agency in terms of what they're seeing, but are not actually received at the other end. Or you ignore it, and you don't show it to the law enforcement agency, in which case the bad guy can reconfigure his computer on the other end to accept packets with bad checksums, and he can communicate without getting surveilled. It turns out that this problem is actually pretty complicated in practice, and there's a bunch of research that you can go read about it. I don't talk about it any further in this talk. The other security concern that you have to consider is protecting the interface from unauthorized use. There are two kinds of unauthorized use that you need to protect against. One is preventing the provision of unauthorized wiretaps, preventing people who don't have any lawful authority to perform wiretaps from using the thing. The other thing you need to do is prevent authorized wiretaps from collecting information that they weren't authorized to collect. This is called minimization. Basically, the idea is that we only collect what we were supposed to collect. And I'm going to get back to minimization later, but I want to put a question in your mind, and that is, where should minimization happen in this infrastructure? Should it happen in the router? Or should the router just collect all the content that's going across and send it all to the mediation device, and the mediation device can sort it out? Or maybe the router should take all the content on the internet or on the network and send it to the law enforcement agency and let the law enforcement agency sort out what they want and what they don't want. That architectural question is at the heart of some of the technical debate that's going on about how to do this properly, and we'll come back to it. So a friend of mine said that I needed to have more network diagrams in this talk, so I fired up Visio and I made a few. This is a typical service provider network. This service provider cloud is going to have a bunch of core routers in it. It's going to have edge routers. I brought out one edge router on the side there at the bottom, and he's providing internet access to a couple of customers down there, one of whom is our suspected drug dealer or something. Somewhere in the service provider network, there's a service provider management network, which is where all the computers that the service provider uses to run their network reside. Hopefully, it's firewalled. And in there probably is your mediation device, which is where these wiretaps are provisioned from. So this is how the traffic flows, or this is how the traffic is supposed to flow when things are working properly. The mediation device sends this one single packet intercept request through the network to the router, and the router sends the content back to the mediation device. This is the attack that I'm proposing, if you will, in this talk. An attacker out on the internet sends an intercept request to the router, and the router sends the content he asked for back over the internet to the attacker. This is an idealistic situation, and I'll give you a more realistic network map later. So what the attacker has to do to pull that off is send an unauthorized interception request. It's a single UDP packet. But in order to generate it, he has to have a few pieces of information. First of all, he has to know the correct username and password for the SNMP v3 interface on the router. Of course, if he's exploiting that vulnerability that was disclosed last summer, he doesn't need to know the password. He just needs the username. He also needs to know the correct engine ID, engine boots, and engine time values. These are values that are used in SNMP v3 to prevent the replay of authenticated transactions. Basically, you use this HMAC, which I'll talk about a little bit more, this message digest in SNMP v3 to authenticate messages. And they want to prevent someone who's surveilling the network from replaying messages that were sent that were properly authenticated. So they make sure that each transaction is unique using some numbers that the router passes out. And they're not secret numbers. You can get them from the router without a username or password. It will hand them out to anybody. And their only purpose is to prevent the replay of transactions that were authenticated. So it's easy to get them. Once the attacker has gotten the router to accept an unauthorized intercept request, the router, he can send the traffic that he's collecting anywhere on the global internet. One of the things people say is, well, what if they have an access list? The Cisco routers do not enforce access lists on content that emanates from the router itself. Try it. It doesn't work. So you can't specify an access list that filters outbound traffic from the router, currently the way it's implemented. So there are 6 vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the design of this protocol or in the implementation of the protocol that I think contribute to the reality that this attack that I'm talking about could be practical on a real-world network today. And I'm going to go through each one of these vulnerabilities and talk about it. And each one individually probably isn't a big deal, but when you add them all up together, the situation is fairly weak in practice, depending upon how the service provider deployed the stuff. So the first thing is that it's really easy to brute force SNMP v3 usernames and passwords, because SNMP v3 is very helpful to you if you're trying to do that. If you send it a packet and it rejects it because it wasn't properly authenticated, it tells you why. You used a bad username. You had the wrong password. You used the wrong engine time, or your thing didn't decrypt right. You get all this verbose information. This is a classic security mistake that has been made in all kinds of different protocols, and it's actually built into the SNMP v3 standard. So the attacker can try different usernames until he gets a good one, and it will tell him when he got one. And then he can try different passwords for that username until he gets a good one. And so the amount of guessing that he has to do is constrained. But you don't have to brute force passwords, as I've mentioned a couple times so far in this talk, if your router is vulnerable to this particular vulnerability. So as I mentioned, these SNMP v3 messages are authenticated with a message digest. And I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but the message digest is essentially a cryptographic hash of the content of the message combined with a secret. And so the way that standard is specified, you take the client takes the first 12 bytes of this cryptographic hash, it puts it in the SNMP v3 request, and sends it on to the router. The router gets the request, and then it performs its own cryptographic hash calculation, and then it compares that result with what was sent in the packet. The router is supposed to throw the packet away if it doesn't have exactly a 12-byte hash in it. But for some reason, a lot of people didn't implement that. And because your actual hash calculation is going to have a result that's longer than 12 bytes, the memory comparison operation has to be constrained by something. And a lot of people constrained it by the length of the hash in the packet, which is another classic security mistake. Don't trust lengths in packets. The consequence of this is that the attacker need only send one byte. And if that byte is the same as the first valid byte of the valid message digest, the packet is considered authenticated and he gets in. In practice, this means he sends 256 interception requests with all different values of that first byte, and one of them will be accepted. This vulnerability was disclosed in June of 2008. It impacted a lot of people, a lot of SNMP implementations, not just Cisco's. Some implementations were vulnerable for over 6 years. What's interesting is most of the Cisco router, most of the iOS versions that support this lawful intercept capability were not actually vulnerable to this bug. And that's weird because lawful intercept has been a part of Cisco routers for many years now. And so there were many years when some Cisco SNMP implementations had this bug and others did not. I found one that had both the feature and the bug, and it supports, it runs on these Cisco 1000 or 10,000 series routers. These are edge routers for broadband service providers like DSL or cable modem companies. So there's a lot of people's home internet access might be provided through a router like this. One of the things that this router does that I have a personal axe to grind about is it supports service provider VPNs. In the security industry, when we sell VPNs, we're selling an encrypted tunnel between 2 points so that a company can build a secure connection between remote offices. And I think that people have this built-in expectation that when you say VPN, you mean encryption. But there are a lot of service providers that sell service provider VPNs that don't have encryption. And I personally feel like it's a confusing thing to use the same word to refer to something that doesn't involve cryptography. When you push service providers about this, what they tell you is you don't have to worry about that because service provider networks are not subject to unauthorized surveillance. Well, guess what? Yes, they are. And you can actually specify a VPN in the interception request. So you can specify any of the VPNs that is configured on the router. So in addition, this is the third issue. There's a lack of audit trails here. First of all, attacks on SNMP v3 authentication are very noisy. If you're brute forcing usernames and passwords, you're sending a lot of stuff that's getting rejected. Even this password attack involves sending 256 requests, one of which is going to get tossed out, right? So you would think that a service provider would be able to notice that. Cisco's Lawful Intercept documentation advises you to configure SNMP traps. And the documentation strongly implies that SNMP v3 authentication failures, or at least it used to imply that SNMP v3 authentication failures would produce traps. So I tested this on all of the iOS versions that I had in my lab, and it didn't work. No authentication failure traps were issued for any out-of-whack SNMP v3 messages. So I sent this to Cisco. I thought it was an implementation bug, and I said, "No, this doesn't work. What's the story?" I don't know why I was not privy to the debate that occurred internally in Cisco when I sent them this, but they decided that the implementation was right and the documentation was wrong. And they apparently changed the documentation so that it no longer says that traps are generated when SNMP v3 authentication failures occur. So to me, I think that a network administrator would want to know that his network was under attack. And so it would be a good idea to fix this, but I'm going to talk about what I recommend be done about all this at the end of the talk. There's another problem in the audit trail space, and this is the sort of key architectural flaw that I think exists in a lot of this lawful intercept technology. The user can turn the logs off. The control, so that the router will generate SNMP traps that tell you that a wiretap is taking place. But you can specify in the interception request that you don't want those traps to be generated, and the router won't generate them. So the attacker can just say, don't log this. Don't create an audit trail, please. There's actually a reason that they designed this way. In the service provider, the people who are responsible for provisioning wiretaps are not the same people that run the network. And they don't want the people who run the network to find out what the police are doing. You know, they don't want the router, if the router administrator could specify any destination address for traps related to lawful intercept, he could add in an IP address of his computer at home. And any time a lawful intercept, the lawful intercept interface was used, he would get notified. And he could call his friends up and say, hey, Louie, you need to stop going to those websites. They have a warrant this time. So that's a problem, right? So basically, they've decided to implement this stuff in many cases without an audit trail. And I'm gonna discuss. I think there's actually a better way to do this so that there would be an audit trail, but the router administrator is not able to play games like that. And I'll talk about that later. Another issue is the flexibility of the output stream. This is the fourth problem. You can send, once you've gotten an interception request accepted by the router, you can send the traffic anywhere on the global network over any port or any service. You can send it as a UDP formatted, this packet cable UDP format. You can send it as a bunch of RTP traffic, which is also a UDP stream. You can send it as a TCP session. And you can also send it as SCTP. So you can send the TAP over port 53 as a bunch of UDP packets. So all the packet filters in the network think it's DNS traffic. No one filters DNS. Ask Dan Kaminsky. The fifth problem is that this interface is highly susceptible to packet spoofing because it's just a single UDP packet that you need to issue an interception request. Now, there are a couple access lists that people might have specified, and they're not useless. Usually a service provider will specify an access list that says that routers will only take SNMP traffic from devices on the network that are part of the service provider's management LAN. And this is useful because you have to get these engine values. It's theoretically possible to get the engine values without actually requesting them from the router. The engine ID defaults to the MAC address of the router, which you might be able to get from the network, possibly. The other values start counting from 0, and so they have a bias toward low numbers, which might make them easy to predict. Yeah, it's sort of in this gray area between it's not impossible, but it might be impractical. And so I think that a service provider infrastructure access list probably mitigates this a little bit. And so this is what I think is a realistic attack scenario. In this case, the attacker has owned a computer that's in the service provider management network. That's not far-fetched at all. Although many of those computers would not be as protected as carefully as the mediation device. And he generates this interception request, which he sends from that network to the router. And then the router sends the intercepted traffic out to the internet to his box out there. There is another access list that you can specify, and it ends up being useful, but not by itself. It's also something that I don't think anyone does, because it's not well documented. You can specify an access list for an SNMP user group. So the SNMP user group that has access to perform intercepts could be constrained to come only from the IP address of the mediation device. So the thing about that is that the attacker can use the fact that he's on the service provider network to get the engine values from the router, and then when he forms his interception request, he can just spoof that from the mediation device's address, and it will get accepted. So that doesn't fix the problem. I also don't think anyone's doing it, because it's not in the SNMP hardening guides, it's not in the lawful intercept guide. You really probably don't know about it unless you like playing around with the question mark on the iOS console. So another problem is that there's no requirement for encryption. And I don't think you can actually do this safely unless you're encrypting it. But I know that there are a lot of providers out there that do not encrypt this. Cisco says, although encryption is not necessarily a requirement, it is highly recommended. There are two kinds of encryption which you could potentially use, and they have different security properties. One thing you could do is SNMP v3 has its own built-in encryption. And you could use it. And it's not a bad idea because it protects you from that password guessing vulnerability that I talked about, because there's a different key that's used for the encryption. And so the attacker would also have to get that key. However, even if you did that, I'm still concerned about the security of this interface, particularly from insiders. Because there's no audit trail, you can still spoof the packets, and the output stream goes anywhere on the internet. This is still kind of an issue. So IPsec is a better solution. You can build an IPsec tunnel from the mediation device to the router, and that will encrypt not only your interception request going out, but all of the content coming back. Now, here's the problem. If you look at this network diagram, the interception request isn't coming from the mediation device, it's coming from another address. And so the router is not going to expect it to be encrypted. And the output stream is not going back to the mediation device, it's going to another destination on the internet, so the router is not going to encrypt that either. The only way that IPsec really protects you is if you couple it with that SNMP user group access list that I talked about. So that you only accept interception requests from the mediation device's IP, and you only accept traffic from that IP if it's IPsec encrypted. If you do both those things, this interface is pretty safe. So how practical is this attack? In the real world, what are people doing? I think that people are probably using that infrastructure access list that I talked about. I think some service providers might still be vulnerable to this bug from last summer because people don't upgrade their routers. It's just an operational risk, and so often people don't do it. There are many service providers that are not using encryption, and I don't think you can protect this interface adequately if you're not using encryption. And I don't think anyone's using that user group access list that I talked about. So in practice, this attack scenario is fairly practical. And I want to talk about another, has anyone ever attacked Lawful Intercept is a valid question to ask. This stuff never happens, right? So there's only one case that I know about where it's confirmed, it's not a rumor, that this really happened. It happened in Greece during the Summer Olympics that were there a few years ago. Someone installed some malware. This did not involve Cisco equipment. It involved an Ericsson cellular telephone switch. Somebody installed some malware, rootkit, in the phone switch. And these Ericsson engineers actually found this thing because they were auditing core dumps in order to troubleshoot a vulnerability. And they found assembly code in the binary that they didn't write. Can you imagine? And it turned out it was spying on people. This is like the technical support escalation nightmare from hell. But it turns out they were spying on like 100 senior members of the Greek government. They were spying on the Greek prime minister. What's really interesting about this, well, there's two things I want to say. The first is that these guys wrote malware that runs on a phone switch. This is really complicated. This is much more sophisticated than what I'm talking about, which is just generating an SNMP v3 request. Most of the people in this room could write software that generates an SNMP v3 request before this talk is over. So this is much more complicated. The second thing I want to point out about this is that if you go read this IEEE Spectrum article that discussed this, and you read between the lines, you see some of the same architectural components that exist in the Cisco architecture, where you've got this thing called the IMS, which is the Intercept Management System, where taps are provisioned, and that's where the audit trail is. And then on the other side, you have this thing called the RES, which is in the phone switch, which actually performs the intercepts. And what this malware did is it attached to the RES and got it to intercept. And they didn't mess with the IMS, so no audit trail was generated. So they've really used the exact same architecture, and they've removed the audit trails from the actual thing that performs the surveillance. And I think that that is a fundamental architectural flaw that affects a lot of Lawful Intercept implementations using different technology, because it all flows from that ETSI standard. So what should we do about all this? How should we address these vulnerabilities? I have recommendations for changes to the SNMP v3 standard that need to be made at the IETF level. I have recommendations for Cisco for how they can change their specific implementation. And I also have recommendations for ISPs that are using this today that need to deploy it safely. And so one of the questions that gets asked is, if this can be deployed safely by an ISP today, why change the protocol? And I had a bunch of slides that are on the CD that relate to this, and I decided to pull them for timing reasons. And because in this room I'm kind of preaching to the choir, you guys get this, but a lot of people that design protocols don't get it. I think that protocols ought to be designed with the anticipation that people will not deploy them in an optimal way. We know we could deploy it in a secure way, but some people won't do that. And so we should design protocols that fail gracefully when they are not deployed properly. And so I think that changes are warranted here to make the things a little bit more secure if the provider didn't do all the right things. So what are my recommendations for SNMP v3? I think that we should make authentication errors less helpful to attackers. Don't tell them why something failed to authenticate, just tell them to go away. At the same time, I think we need to make authentication failures more helpful to network administrators. Instead of telling the attacker why we threw his packet out, we should tell the network administrator that the router's under attack. Furthermore, I think that the engine values should be more difficult to predict and share. This isn't really a flaw, it's just an unanticipated possibility that they didn't consider. They designed these engine values to prevent replay, and they prevent replay well, but they almost prevent spoofing. And if they were improved by making them more similar to SYN cookies, they would effectively prevent spoofing. What you want to do is include the source address that the request came from and a secret, and produce a number that's unpredictable and send it back. And then they can't share it. I can't go collect that number and then use it in a request that I'm spoofing from another address. I think that change could be made without a flag day for SNMP v3. I think that routers could simply start sending out more complicated engine times, and everything would just work. Recommendations for Lawful Intercept. So one of my recommendations is to use a different port. And actually, I should have clarified something earlier. All these recommendations I'm making are from my perspective as a security researcher. I acknowledge that I don't know everything that goes on in the world. I don't know all of the design criteria that were used in designing some of this stuff and all of the reasons why it's designed the way it's designed. And so I accept that some of my recommendations might not be recommendations that can be taken. I'm providing a number of different options, and some of them will work and some of them won't. And anyway, use a different port. There's a lot of SNMP traffic going on a provider's network that's used for all kinds of different purposes. If you move Lawful Intercept to a different port, it's easy to make access lists that filter it specifically instead of general access lists that say everyone who does SNMP can come in and talk to the service. The router administrator should be able to limit the destinations for the output stream. You should not be able to send your content to Botswana over port 53. The router administrator should be able to specify an access list that says this is where you can send content. They should also move notification control into the router configuration. And this goes back to that fundamental architectural flaw that I was talking about, where they don't want the router administrator to be able to notify his buddies when the wiretapping is being performed. So the way to deal with that is to design this so that you get agreement between the router configuration and the interception request. So the router administrator specifies a list of addresses that traps can be sent to. Okay, and then when the mediation device generates the interception request, it specifies an address to send traps to. The router enforces that the interception request specified an address, and then that address is one of the addresses that the router administrator also specified. So in this case, the person generating the interception request must include an address for notification, and that address must be one that the network administrator has agreed to. But conversely, the person who configured the router, cannot send intercept notifications anywhere that the people who run the mediation device haven't agreed to. Nobody can fool around. I think that effectively solves the security concerns involved in the audit trail without eliminating the audit trail entirely, which is what has been done in a lot of these systems. I also have recommendations for proper deployment that came out of this research. First of all, make sure you've patched that SNMP bug. I know it's a pain to patch your router, but it's important when there's a serious security issue. Use encryption, specifically IPsec. If you're not encrypting, then there's no way that you can protect the content coming back. And really, there's no way that you can prevent this interface from being used without authorization. Use the user group IP access control list that I talked about to lock the SNMP user for Lawful Intercept down to the IP address of the mediation device. If you do those three things, this interface is pretty safe. If you're not doing them, then there is a risk that it could be used without authorization. Furthermore, there's all kinds of other things you need to do to run a secure router network, and that discussion is way outside the scope of this talk, obviously. But one of the things you might consider is building out-of-band management networks so that your management traffic is going over a different interface into these routers than the traffic that is part of the network itself. It's expensive to do that. Some providers do it. I think it makes a lot of sense from a security perspective. Although the other thing you need to ask yourself is, how isolated is my out-of-band management network really? Is it really totally isolated from the internet, or are there people in the NOC who can get there, who are browsing the web at 3 in the morning because they're bored and getting malware on their PCs? You've got to think about these things. So all of this discussion leads me to a few conclusions. I think the most important conclusion is that peer review matters. I think that Cisco did the right thing when they published this interface in an RFC so that we can read it and we can understand how this works and we can provide technical feedback. There's a lot of other technology out there, all kinds of different lawful intercept vendors, and have not published their architectures. We can't read them. We don't know how they work. They haven't been subject to auditing. And so although I found some security weaknesses in this design, at least we know what they are and what we can do to mitigate them. There are all kinds of other architectures out there that we haven't been subject to any peer review, and we can't be confident at all about their security properties as a result. And we know that nobody ever builds anything perfectly. That's why they've been having black hat conferences for years, because there's always new vulnerabilities. And so the reality is that it's not appropriate to expect somebody to go out the gate with an architecture and for it to be free from security risk. What's appropriate is for them to subject that system to peer review and analysis, and over time we can improve its security to the point where it is actually reasonable. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this case. So I think this is how this should work. The other thing is that it's interesting. So in U.S. law, the way that the judiciary and executive, so the way that the checks and balances work there regarding unauthorized surveillance is that if the police go collect information that they weren't authorized to collect and they show up in court with it, it gets thrown out. It's called the exclusionary rule. They can only use information that they obtained lawfully. And so the thing that creates a negative incentive for unauthorized surveillance by the executive branch is the way that the court system operates trials. This piece of software actually pushes the interface between the executive and judicial branch to a different place. And it actually prevents the executive branch from collecting information they weren't authorized to collect in the first place. And that's interesting to me. And if we're going to have software that's actually forming an interface between two branches of our government, it's important that the nature of that interface be publicly described and that we all have the ability to understand how it works. Because it's not just the router vendor and the ISP who have interest at stake in the nature of that interface. We all do. So there are a lot of architectures out there that have not been subject to peer review, and I want to provide an example of one. There's this thing called the Klein Declaration. There's this guy named Mark Klein who used to work for AT&T, and he retired, and he went to the EFF and he told them that his employer had asked him to install a fiber optic splitter in their network and send the traffic on the network off to some room that allegedly is operated by the NSA. And so there's a bunch of documentation on the internet that he provided, that relates to what he is alleging occurred. Assuming he's not crazy, this is a lawful intercept architecture that has not been subject to peer review, and we wouldn't know about it unless this guy was willing to take a risk and talk about it publicly. It has different security properties than the one we've just discussed. In some respects, maybe it's harder. We don't know for sure because it really hasn't been subject to a lot of analysis, but it might be harder to use without authorization because it's harder to generate a packet that manipulates a physical fiber optic splitter. But on the other hand, all of the minimization is occurring in the law enforcement organization or the intelligence agency. There isn't minimization occurring in the ISP. And so it might not be as effective at preventing the collection of information that the organization was not authorized to collect. And that's an important security property too. So this leads me to some personal thoughts about this great debate that's been going on. And I want to tell you, I think some of this, is heresy in this room, and I'm not like a zealot, and I'm not trying to tell you that I'm convinced that these answers are right. What I'm saying is that I've been thinking about this, and these are some thoughts that I had, and I want to present them to you so you can think about it too, and let's talk about it, and we'll see, maybe you can prove me wrong about some of this stuff. It used to be really easy to wiretap with, illegal wiretapping used to be really easy, right? You could open a junction box and hook up some alligator clips and listen to anyone's phone calls. With a portable scanner, you could listen to cellular phones or cordless phones. It was open. And it actually seems like in the last 20 years, it's getting harder to do illegal wiretapping. There are encryption standards in play in these cell phones, so you can't just listen with the scanner anymore. Your cordless phone is probably digital spread spectrum, so it's a little bit harder to tap. A lot of the landline traffic is actually encoded. It's DSL traffic, it's data traffic, and so you need an expensive protocol analyzer in order to listen to it. You can't just like use alligator clips in a phone. So it's getting complicated. I think that it might get a little cheaper in the future because I think people will use software-defined radios as protocol analyzers to listen to DSL and cable modem traffic. But generally speaking, it's much harder than it was 20 years ago, and it's going to remain harder. And so what that tells me is that wiretapping is neither easy nor impossible. It's not black and white. We have not had the broad adoption of end-to-end cryptography that the IETF argued for in RFC 1984. People use cryptography, but they use it if it's baked into what they're doing. They use link layer encryption with their cell phone, or they use application layer encryption with SSL. But if they've got to think about keys, forget it. And so one observation that we could make is that link layer encryption helps prevent illegal wiretapping. We've hardened cell phones effectively. We might want to consider hardening other protocols, even land protocols more effectively, using link layer encryption. I think that will reduce the amount of illegal wiretapping that goes on. Sometimes law enforcement resists link layer encryption when it interferes with how they perform intercepts. And we saw this happen with GSM, where there apparently were some weaknesses that were introduced in order to make it easier for someone with expensive equipment to listen. So we have to ask this question, given that wiretapping is neither easy nor it's impossible. There's going to be wiretapping performed, and we have to ask, how is that wiretapping going to work? And there are a couple different ways it could work. It could work with temporary or permanent devices. A temporary device like a protocol analyzer that somebody checks out of the storeroom and they go hook it up to the network, or a permanent infrastructure that's built into the network. It is the consensus view of a lot of computer security researchers that the permanent infrastructure is a bad idea, and we should stick with temporary devices. There are a lot of august names who have signed themselves up to that view, including people like Whitfield Diffie and Stephen Bellevin, who have contributed. I can't hold a candle to everything that those guys have contributed over the years. So I'm really stepping out on a limb here by potentially disagreeing with them, but I developed another perspective on this while looking at this stuff. And that is that if you have a permanent infrastructure, you have to have an access control facility to get to that permanent infrastructure. And that access control facility can validate that the people that are using the infrastructure actually have the lawful authorization to do so. If you have temporary protocol analyzers, you can't control them. The guys come in, they check it out, they go do some tapping, they do minimization in the device itself. Maybe they collected some additional information, maybe they didn't. Unless you have some sort of tamper-proof audit trail that's built into the device, there's really no way to tell what happened with it until while it was checked out. So there's potentially a value to having a permanent infrastructure with an access control mechanism, as long as that access control mechanism actually controls access. And so there's a bunch of assumptions built into that. One is that we can close off other means of getting access to the content. We can encrypt the link layers so that the only real way to perform wiretapping is to go through this funnel. Another is that we need to be able to see how the architecture works so that we know it's actually doing what we think. Furthermore, the people who are validating and providing access to that infrastructure need to actually provide a check. There are a lot of people out there who think that the service providers should simply be a rubber stamp, and they should cooperate and assist law enforcement regardless of whether or not they really have lawful authorization, or they're under extinction circumstances, they should just give them access. And that perspective undermines the validity of this technical argument. Because if the access control doesn't actually control access, then it doesn't provide any value that you're trading for the risk associated with having an interface that could come under attack. So basically what I'm saying here is that by taking a couple steps, we might be able to move toward an infrastructure where illegal wiretapping is very difficult, but we also have mechanisms in place that help uphold our system of checks and balances. And that might ultimately be the best sort of lawful intercept architecture that we could get. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm sure that some of you will have questions. So now's a good time for that. Maybe you don't. Everyone's very quiet. Really? No questions? Okay. All right. Thank you.